The Selected Letters of David Herbert Lawrence. This is a Penguin book, and it contains lots of background about the correspondence between Aldous Huxley and D.H. Lawrence. This is Penguin book 759, and let's look to the publication details. First published 1950, reprinted 1954 and 1961. So this book, 1961. In the front we read, David Herbert Lawrence was born at Eastwood, Nottinghamshire in 1885, the fourth child of a miner. At 13 he won a scholarship to Nottingham High School, which he left for a job with a firm of surgical goods manufacturers at a wage of 13 shillings a week. He soon abandoned this to become a pupil teacher at Eastwood. While attending Nottingham University for his teacher's certificate, he began his first novel, The White Peacock. This was published by Heinemann in 1911. From that time onwards, with the exception of a short period as a schoolmaster in Croydon, he lived entirely by his writing. For 2 years he travelled in Germany and Italy, and, returning to England, was married in July 1914 to Frieda von Richthofen. In 1919, the Lawrences left England and travelled, first in Europe and then in Australia and America. They settled for a while in New Mexico, but came back finally to Europe in 1929. In that year, Lawrence became seriously ill, and he died of tuberculosis on the 2nd of March, 1930. I'm going to share with you the introduction in this chapter, but I'm reading from the book Letters of D.H. Lawrence, selected by Richard Aldington, with an introduction by Aldous Huxley. Introduction. I always say my motto is art for art's sake. In fact, he doesn't say that. He says my motto is art for my sake. The words are from a letter written by Lawrence before the war. If I want to write, I write, and if I don't want to, I won't. The difficulty is to find exactly the form one's passion, work is produced by passion with me, like kisses, is it with you, wants to take. Art for my sake. But even though for my sake still art, Lawrence was always and unescapably an artist. Yes, unescapably is the word. For there were moments when he wanted to escape from his destiny. I wish from the bottom of my heart that the fates had not stigmatized me writer. It is a sickening business. But against the decree of fate there is no appeal, nor was it by any means at all the time that Lawrence wanted to appeal. His complaints were only occasional, and he was provoked to make them, not by any hatred of art as such, but by hatred of the pains and humiliations incidental to practicing as an artist. Writing to Edward Garnett, why, he asks, should we be plagued with literature and such like tomfoolery? Why can't we live decent, honourable lives without the critics in the little theatre fretting us? The publication of a work of art is always the exposure of a nakedness, the throwing of something delicate and sensitive to the asses, apes, and dogs. Mostly, however, Lawrence loved his destiny, loved the art of which he was a master, as who, that is, master, can fail to do? Besides, art as he practiced it, and as, at the bottom, every artist, even the most pharisaical, pure, practices it, was art for my sake. It was useful to him, pragmatically helpful. One sheds one's sicknesses in books, repeats and presents again one's emotions to be master of them. And anyhow, liking or disliking were finally irrelevant in the face of the fact that Lawrence was, in a real sense, possessed by his creative genius. He could not help himself. I am doing a novel, he writes in an early letter, a novel which I have never grasped. Damn its eyes, there I am at page 145, and I've no notion of what it's about. I hate it. F says it is good, but it's like a novel in a foreign language I don't know very well. I can only just make out what it's about. To this strange force within him, to this power that created his works of art, there was nothing to do but submit. Lawrence submitted, completely and with reverence. I often think one ought to be able to pray before one works, and then leave it to the Lord. Isn't it hard work to come to real grips with one's imagination, throw everything overboard? I always feel as though I stood naked for the fire of Almighty God to go through me, and it's rather an awful feeling. One has to be so terribly religious to be an artist. Conversely, he might have added, one has to be terribly an artist, terribly conscious of inspiration and the compelling force of genius, to be religious as Lawrence was religious. It is impossible to write about Lawrence except as an artist. He was an artist first of all, and the fact of his being an artist explains a life which seems, if you forget it, inexplicably strange. In Son of Woman, Mr. Middleton Murray has written at great length about Lawrence, but about a Lawrence whom you would never suspect from reading that curious essay and destructive hagiography of being an artist. For Mr. Murray almost completely ignores the fact that his subject, his victim, I had almost said, was one whom the fates had stigmatized writer. His book is Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark, for all its metaphysical subtleties and its Freudian ingenuities, very largely irrelevant. The absurdity of his critical method becomes the more manifest when we realize and reflect that nobody would ever have heard of a Lawrence who was not an artist. An artist is the sort of artist he is because he happens to possess certain gifts, and he leads the sort of life he does in fact lead because he is an artist, and an artist with a particular kind of mental endowment. Now, there are general abilities and there are special talents. A man who is born with a great share of some special talent is probably less deeply affected by nurture than one whose ability is generalized. His gift is his fate, and he follows a predestined course, from which no ordinary power can deflect him. In spite of Helvetius and Dr. Watson, it seems pretty obvious that no amount of education, including under that term everything from the Oedipus complex to the English public school system, no amount of education could have prevented Mozart from being a musician, or musicianship from being the central fact in Mozart's life. And how would a different education have modified the expression of, say, Blake's gift? It is, of course, impossible to answer. One can only express the unverifiable conviction that an art so profoundly individual and original, so manifestly inspired, would have remained fundamentally the same whatever, within reasonable limits, had been the circumstances of Blake's upbringing. Lawrence, as Mr. F.R. Leavis insists, has many affinities with Blake. He had the same gift of knowing what he was interested in, the same power of distinguishing his own feelings and emotions from conventional sentiment, the same terrifying honesty. Like Blake, like any man possessed of great special talents, he was predestined by his gifts. Explanations of him in terms of a Freudian hypothesis of nurture may be interesting, but they do not explain. That Lawrence was profoundly affected by his love for his mother and by her excessive love for him is obvious to anyone who has read Sons and Lovers. None the less it is, to me at any rate, almost equally obvious that even if his mother had died when he was a child, Lawrence would still have been essentially and fundamentally Lawrence. Lawrence's biography does not account for Lawrence's achievement. On the contrary, his achievement, or rather the gift that made the achievement possible, accounts for a great deal of his biography. He lived as he lived because he was, intrinsically and from birth, what he was. If we would write intelligibly of Lawrence, we must answer, with all their implications, two questions. First, what sort of gifts did he have? And secondly, how did the possession of these gifts affect the way he responded to experience? Lawrence's special and characteristic gift was an extraordinary sensitiveness to what Wordsworth called unknown modes of being. He was always intensely aware of the mystery of the world. And the mystery was always for him a noumen, divine. Lawrence would never forget, as most of us almost continuously forget, the dark presence of the otherness that lies beyond the boundaries of man's conscious mind. This special sensibility was accompanied by a prodigious power of rendering the immediately experienced otherness in terms of literary art. Such was Lawrence's peculiar gift. His possession of it accounts for many things. It accounts, to begin with, for his attitude towards sex. His particular experiences as a son and as a lover may have intensified his preoccupation with the subject, but they certainly did not make it. Whatever his experiences, Lawrence must have been preoccupied with sex. His gift made it inevitable. For Lawrence, the significance of the sexual experience was this, that in it the immediate, non-mental knowledge of divine otherness is brought, so to speak, to a focus of darkness. Parodying Matthew Arnold's famous formula, we may say that sex is something not ourselves that makes for, not righteousness, for the essence of religion is not righteousness. There is a spiritual world, as Kierkegaard insists, beyond the ethical, rather that makes for life, for divineness, for union with the mystery. Paradoxically, this something not ourselves is yet a something lodged within us. This quintessence of otherness is yet the quintessence of our proper being. And God the Father, the inscrutable, the unknowable, we know in the flesh, in woman. She is the door for our ingoing and our outcoming. In her we go back to the Father, but like the witnesses of the Transfiguration, blind and unconscious. Yes, blind and unconscious. Otherwise it is a revelation not of divine otherness, but of very human evil. The embrace of love, which should bring darkness and oblivion, would, with these lovers, the hero and heroine of one of Poe's tales, be a daytime thing, bringing more heightened consciousness, visions, spectrum visions, prismatic, the evil thing that daytime lovemaking is, and all sex palaver. How Lawrence hated Eleonora and Ligeia and Roderick Usher and all such soulful Mrs. Shandyes, male as well as female. What a horror, too, he had of all Don Juans, all-knowing sensualists and conscious libertines. About the time he was writing Lady Chatterley's Lover, he read the memoirs of Casanova and was profoundly shocked. How bitterly he loathed the Wilhelm Meisterish view of love as an education, as a means to culture, a Sandow exerciser for the soul. To use love in this way, consciously and deliberately, seemed to Lawrence wrong, almost a blasphemy. It seems to me queer, he says to a fellow writer, that you prefer to present men chiefly, as if you cared for women not so much for what they were in themselves, as for what the men saw in them. So that after all, in your work, women seem not to have an existence, save that they are the projections of the men. It's the positivity of women you seem to deny, making them sort of instrumental. The instrumentality of Wilhelm Meister's women shocked Lawrence profoundly. Here, in a parenthesis, let me remark on the fact that Lawrence's doctrine is constantly invoked by people of whom Lawrence himself would passionately have disapproved, in defense of a behavior which he would have found deplorable or even revolting. That this should have happened is by no means, of course, a condemnation of the doctrine. The same philosophy of life may be good or bad, according as the person who accepts it and lives by it, it is intrinsically fine or base. Tartuffe's doctrine was the same, after all, as Pascal's. There have been refined fetish worshippers and unspeakably swinish Christians. To the preacher of a new way of life, the most depressing thing that can happen is, surely, success. For success permits him to see how he has converted, distort, and debase, and make ignoble parodies of his teachings. If Francis of Assisi had lived to be 100, what bitterness he would have tasted. Happily for the saint, he died at 45, still relatively undisillusioned, because still on the threshold of the great success of his order. Writers influence their readers, preachers their auditors, but always, at bottom, to be more themselves. If the reader's self happens to be intrinsically similar to the writer's, then the influence is what the writer would wish it to be. If he is intrinsically unlike the writer, then he will probably twist the writer's doctrine into a rationalization of beliefs, an excuse for behavior wholly alien to the beliefs and behavior approved by the writer. Lawrence has suffered the fate of every man whose works have exercised an influence upon his fellows. It was inevitable and in the nature of things. For someone with the gift of sensing the mystery of otherness, true love must necessarily be, in Lawrence's vocabulary, nocturnal. So must true knowledge. Nocturnal and tactual, a touching in the night. Man inhabits for his own convenience a homemade universe within the greater alien world of external matter and of his own irrationality. Out of the illimitable blackness of that world, the light of his customary thinking scoops, as it were, a little illuminated cave, a tunnel of brightness, in which, from the birth of consciousness to its death, he lives, moves, and has his being. For most of us, this bright tunnel is the whole world. We ignore the outer darkness, or if we cannot ignore it, if it presses too insistently upon us, we disapprove, being afraid. Not so Lawrence. He had eyes that could see beyond the walls of light, far into the darkness, sensitive fingers that kept him continually aware of the environing mystery. He could not be content with the homemade, human tunnel, could not conceive that anyone else should be content with it. Moreover, and in this he was unlike those others to whom the world's mystery is continuously present, the great philosophers and men of science, moreover, he did not want to increase the illuminated area. He approved of the outer darkness. He felt at home in it. Most men live in a little puddle of light thrown by the gig lamps of habit and their immediate interest. But there is also the pure and powerful illumination of the disinterested scientific intellect. To Lawrence, both lights were suspect. Both seemed to falsify what was for him the immediately apprehended reality, the darkness of mystery. My great religion, he was already saying in 1912, is a belief in the blood, the flesh, as being wiser than the intellect. We can go wrong in our minds, but what the blood feels and believes and says is always true. Like Blake, who had prayed to be delivered from single vision and Newton sleep, like Keats, who had drunk destruction to Newton for having explained the rainbow, Lawrence disapproved of too much knowledge on the score that it diminished men's sense of wonder and blunted their sensitiveness to the great mystery. His dislike of science was passionate and expressed itself in the most fantastically unreasonable terms. All scientists are liars, he would say, when I brought up some experimentally established fact which he happened to dislike. Liars, liars. It was a most convenient theory. I remember in particular one long and violent argument on evolution, in the reality of which Lawrence always passionately disbelieved. But look at the evidence, Lawrence, I insisted. Look at all the evidence. His answer was characteristic. But I don't care about evidence. Evidence doesn't mean anything to me. I don't feel it here. And he pressed his two hands on his solar plexus. I abandoned the argument and thereafter never, if I could avoid it, mentioned the hated name of science in his presence. Lawrence could give so much, and what he gave was so valuable, that it was absurd and profitless to spend one's time with him disputing a matter in which he absolutely refused to take a rational interest. Whatever the intellectual consequences, he remained through thick and thin unshakably loyal to his own genius. The demon which possessed him was, he felt, a divine thing, which he would never deny or explain away, never ask to accept a compromise. This loyalty to his own self, or rather to his gift, to the strange and powerful Newman which, he felt, used him as its tabernacle, is fundamental in Lawrence, and accounts, as nothing else can do, for all that the world found strange in his beliefs and his favour. It was not an incapacity to understand that made him reject those generalizations and abstractions by means of which the philosophers and the men of science try to open a path for the human spirit through the chaos of phenomena. Not incapacity, I repeat, for Lawrence had, over and above his peculiar gift, an extremely acute intelligence. He was a clever man as well as a man of genius. In his boyhood and adolescence he had been a great passer of examinations. He could have understood the aim and methods of science perfectly well if he had wanted to. Indeed, he did understand them perfectly well, and it was for that very reason that he rejected them. For the methods of science and critical philosophy were incompatible with the exercise of his gift, the immediate perception and artistic rendering of divine otherness. And their aim, which is to push back the frontier of knowledge, of the unknown, was not to be reconciled with his aim, which was to remain as intimately as possible in contact with the surrounding darkness. And so, in spite of their enormous prestige, he rejected science and critical philosophy. He remained loyal to his gift, exclusively loyal. He would not attempt to qualify or explain his immediate knowledge of the mystery, would not even attempt to supplement it by other abstract knowledge. These terrible conscious birds, like Poe and his Ligeia, deny the very life that is in them. They want to turn it all into talk, into knowing, and so life, which will not be known, leaves them. Lawrence refused to know abstractly. He preferred to live and wanted other people to live. No man is by nature complete and universal. He cannot have first-hand knowledge of every kind of possible human experience. Universality, therefore, can be achieved only by those who mentally stimulate living experience, by the knowers, in a word, by people like Goethe, an artist for whom Lawrence always felt the most intense repugnance. Again, no man is by nature perfect, and none can spontaneously achieve perfection. The greatest gift is a limited gift. Perfection, whether ethical or aesthetic, must be the result of knowing and of the laborious application of knowledge. Formal aesthetics are an affair of rules and the best classical models, formal morality of the Ten Commandments and the imitation of Christ. Lawrence would have nothing to do with proceedings so unnatural, so disloyal to the gift, to the resident or visiting Newman. Hence his aesthetic principle that art must be wholly spontaneous and, like the artist, imperfect, limited, and transient. Hence, too, his ethical principle that a man's first moral duty is not to attempt to live above his human station or beyond his inherited psychological income. The great work of art and the monument more perennial than brass are, in their very perfection and everlastingness, inhuman, too much of a good thing. Lawrence did not approve of them. Art, he thought, should flower from an immediate impulse towards self-expression or communication, and should wither with the passing of the impulse. Of all building materials, Lawrence liked adobe the best. Its extreme plasticity and extreme impermanence endeared it to him. There could be nothing everlasting, no everlasting pyramids in adobe, no mathematically accurate Parthenons, nor, thank heavens, in wood. Lawrence loved the Etruscans, among other reasons, because they built wooden temples which have not survived. Stone oppressed him with its indestructible solidity, its capacity to take and indefinitely keep the hard, uncompromising forms of pure geometry. Great buildings made him feel uncomfortable, even when they were beautiful. He felt something of the same discomfort in the presence of any highly finished work of art. In music, for example, he liked the folk song, because it was a slight thing born of immediate impulse. The symphony oppressed him. It was too big, too elaborate, too carefully and consciously worked out, too would-be, to use a characteristic Lawrencean expression. He was quite determined that none of his writings should be would-be. He allowed them to flower as they liked from the depths of his being, and would never use his conscious intellect to force them into a semblance of more than human perfection or more than human universality. It was characteristic of him that he hardly ever corrected or patched what he had written. I have often heard him say, indeed, that he was incapable of correcting. If he was dissatisfied with what he had written, he did not, as most others do, file, clip, insert, transpose. He rewrote. In other words, he gave the daemon another chance to say what it wanted to say. There are, I believe, 3 complete and totally distinct manuscripts of Lady Chatterley's Lover. Nor was this by any means the only novel that he wrote more than once. He was determined that all he produced should spring direct from the mysterious, irrational source of power within him. The conscious intellect should never be allowed to come and impose after the event its abstract pattern of perfection. It was the same in the sphere of ethics as in that of art. I'll repeat that line. It was the same in the sphere of ethics as in that of art. They want me to have form. That means they want me to have their pernicious, ossiferous, skin and grief form, but I won't. This was written about his novels, but is just as applicable to his life. Every man, Lawrence insisted, must be an artist in life, must create his own moral form. The art of living is harder than the art of writing. It is a much more delicate thing to make love and win love than to declare love. All the more reason, therefore, for practicing this art with the most refined and subtle sensibility. All the more reason for not accepting that pernicious skin and grief form of morality which they are always trying to impose on one. It is the business of the sensitive artist in life to accept his own nature as it is, not to try to force it into another shape. He must take the material given him, the weaknesses and irrationalities, as well as the sense and the virtues, the mysterious darkness and otherness, no less than the light of reason and the conscious ego, must take them all and weave them together into a satisfactory pattern. His pattern, not somebody else's pattern. Once I said to myself, how can I blame? Why be angry? Now I say, when anger comes with bright eyes, he may do his will. In me, he will hardly shake off the hand of God. He is one of the archangels with a fiery sword. God sent him. It is beyond my knowing. This was written in 1910. Even at the very beginning of his career, Lawrence was envisaging man as simply the locus of a polytheism. Given his particular gifts of sensitiveness and of expression, it was inevitable, just as it was inevitable that a man of Blake's peculiar genus should formulate the very similar doctrine of the independence of states of being. All the generally accepted systems of philosophy and of ethics aim at policing man's polytheism in the name of some Jehovah of intellectual and moral consistency. For Lawrence, this was an indefensible proceeding. One God had as much right to exist as another, and the dark ones were as genuinely divine as the bright. Perhaps, since Lawrence was so specially sensitive to the quality of dark Godhead and so specially gifted to express it in art, perhaps even more divine. Anyhow, the polytheism was a democracy. This conception of human nature resulted in the formulation of 2 rather surprising doctrines, one ontological and the other ethical. The first is what I may call the doctrine of cosmic pointlessness. There is no point. Life and love are life and love. A bunch of violets is a bunch of violets. And to drag in the idea of a point is to ruin everything. Live and let live. Love and let love. Flower and fade, and follow the natural curve which flows on, pointless. Ontological pointlessness has its ethical counterpart in the doctrine of insouciance. They simply are eaten up with caring. They are so busy caring about fascism or leagues of nations or whether France is right or whether marriage is threatened that they never know where they are. They certainly never live on the spot where they are. They inhabit abstract space, the desert void of politics, principles, right and wrong, and so forth. They are doomed to be abstract. Talking to them is like trying to have a human relationship with the letter X in algebra. As early as 1911, his advice to his sister was, "Don't meddle with religion. I would leave all that alone if I were you, and try to occupy myself fully in the present." Reading such passages, and they abound in every book that Lawrence wrote, I am always reminded of that section of the Pensées in which Pascal speaks of the absurd distractions with which men fill their leisure, so that there shall be no hole or cranny left for a serious thought to lodge itself in their consciousness. Lawrence also inveighs against divertissement, but not against the same divertissement as Pascal. For him, there were two great and criminal distractions. First, work, which he regarded as a mere stupefacient like opium. Don't exhaust yourself too much, he writes to an industrious friend. It is immoral. Immoral because, amongst other reasons, it is too easy, a shirking of man's first duty, which is to live. Think of the rest and peace, the positive sloth and luxury of idleness that work is. Lawrence had a real Puritan's disapproval of the vice of working. He attacked the gospel of work for the same reasons as Chrysippus attacked Aristotle's gospel of pure intellectualism, on the ground that it was, in the old Stoics' word, only a kind of amusement, and that real living was a more serious affair than labour or abstract speculations. The other inexcusable distraction in Lawrence's eyes was spirituality, that lofty musing on the ultimate nature of things, which constitutes for Pascal the whole dignity and business of man. Pascal was horrified that human beings could go so far, forget the infinite and the eternal, as to dance and play the lute and sing and make verses. Lawrence was no less appalled that they could so far forget all the delights and difficulties of immediate living as to remember eternity and infinity, to say nothing of the League of Nations and the sanctity of marriage. Both were great artists. And so each is able to convince us that he is at any rate partly right. Just how far each is right, this is not the place to discuss. Nor, indeed, is the question susceptible of a definite answer. Mental consciousness, wrote Lawrence, is a purely individual affair. Some men are born to be highly and delicately conscious. Some are not. Moreover, each of the ages of man has its suitable philosophy of life. Lawrence's, I should say, was not a very good philosophy for old age or failing powers. Besides, there are certain conjunctions of circumstances in which spontaneous living is the great distraction, and certain others in which it is almost criminal to divert oneself with eternity or the League of Nations. Lawrence's particular genius was such that he insisted on spontaneous living to the exclusion of ideals and fixed principles, on intuition to the exclusion of abstract reasoning. Pascal, with a very different gift, evolved inevitably a very different philosophy. Lawrence's dislike of abstract knowledge and pure spirituality made him a kind of mystical materialist. Thus, the moon affects him strongly. Therefore, it cannot be a stony, cold world like a world of our own gone cold. Nonsense. It is a globe of dynamic substance like radium or phosphorus, coagulated upon a vivid pole of energy. Matter must be intrinsically as lively as the mind which perceives it and is moved by the perception. Vivid and violent spiritual effects must have correspondingly vivid and violent material causes. And, conversely, any violent feeling or desire in the mind must be capable of producing violent effects upon external matter. Lawrence could not bring himself to believe that the spirit can be moved if need be to madness, without imparting the smallest corresponding movement to the external world. He was a subjectivist as well as a materialist. In other words, he believed in the possibility, in some form or another, of magic. Lawrence's mystical materialism found characteristic expression in the curious, cosmology, and physiology of his speculative essays in his restatement of the strange Christian doctrine of the resurrection of the body. To his mind, the survival of the spirit was not enough, for the spirit is a man's conscious identity, and Lawrence did not want to be always identical to himself. He wanted to know otherness, to know it by being it, know it in the living flesh, which is always essentially other. Therefore, there must be a resurrection of the body. Loyalty to his genius left him no choice. Lawrence had to insist on those mysterious forces of otherness, which are scattered without and darkly concentrated within the body of mind of man. He had to, even though by doing so he imposed upon himself, as a writer of novels, a very serious handicap. For according to his view of things, most of men's activities were more or less criminal distractions from the proper business of human living. He refused to write of such distractions. That is to say, he refused to write of the main activities of the contemporary world. But as though this drastic limitation of his subject were not sufficient, he went still further and, in some of his novels, refused to write even of human personalities in the accepted sense of the term. The Rainbow and Women in Love, and indeed to a lesser extent all his novels, are the practical applications of a theory which is set forth in a very interesting and important letter to Edward Garnett, dated June 5th, 1914. Lawrence writes, "Somehow that which is physic, non-human in humanity, is more interesting to me than the old-fashioned human element, which causes one to conceive a character in a certain moral scheme and make him consistent. The certain moral scheme is what I object to. In Turgenev and in Tolstoy and in Dostoevsky, the moral scheme into which all the characters fit, and it is nearly the same scheme, is, whatever the extraordinariness of the characters themselves, dull, old, dead. When Marinetti writes, 'It is the solidity of a blade of steel that is interesting by itself,' that is, the incomprehending and inhuman alliance of its molecules in resistance to, let us say, a bullet, the heat of a piece of wood or iron is in fact more passionate for us than the laughter or tears of a woman, then I know what he means. He is stupid as an artist for contrasting the heat of the iron and the laugh of the woman. Because what is interesting in the laugh of the woman is the same as the binding of the molecules of steel, or their action in heat. It is the inhuman will, call it physiology, or like Marinetti, physiology of matter, that fascinates me. I don't so much care about what the woman feels in the ordinary usage of the word. That presumes an ego to feel with. I only care about what the woman is, what she is, inhumanly, physiologically, materially, according to the use of the word. You mustn't look in my novel for the old stable ego of the character. There is another ego according to whose action the individual is unrecognizable, and passes through, as it were, allotropic states which it needs a deeper sense than any we've been used to exercise to discover are states of the same single, radically unchanged element, like as diamond and coal are the same pure single element of carbon. The ordinary novel would trace the history of the diamond, but I say, diamond what? This is carbon. And my diamond might be coal or soot, and my theme is carbon. The dangers and difficulties of this method are obvious. Criticizing Stendhal, Professor Saintsbury long since remarked on that psychological realism which is perhaps a more different thing from psychological reality than our clever ones for 2 generations have been willing to admit, or perhaps able to perceive. Psychological reality, like physical reality, is determined by our mental and bodily makeup. Common sense, working on the evidence supplied by our unaided senses, postulates a world in which physical reality consists of such things as solid, tables and chairs, bits of coal, water, air. Carrying its investigations further, science discovers that these samples of physical reality are really composed of atoms of different elements, and these atoms, in their turn, are really composed of more or less numerous electrons and protons arranged in a variety of patterns. Similarly, there is a common sense, pragmatic conception of psychological reality. And also an uncommon sense conception. For ordinary practical purposes, we conceive human beings as creatures with characters. But analysis of their behaviour can be carried so far that they cease to have characters and reveal themselves as collections of psychological atoms. Lawrence, as might have been expected of a man who could always perceive the otherness behind the most reassuringly familiar phenomenon, Lawrence took the uncommon sense view of psychology. Hence the strangeness of his novels, and hence also, it must be admitted, certain qualities of violent monotony and intense indistinctness, qualities which make some of them, for all their richness and their unexpected beauty, so curiously difficult to get through. Most of us are more interested in diamonds and coal than in undifferentiated carbon, however vividly described. I have known readers whose reaction to Lawrence's books was very much the same as Lawrence's own reactions to the theory of evolution. What he wrote meant nothing to them because they did not feel it here in the solar plexus. That Lawrence, the hater of scientific knowing, should have applied to psychology methods which he himself compared to those of chemical analysis may seem strange. But we must remember that his analysis was done not intellectually, but by an immediate process of intuition, that he was able, as it were, to feel the carbon in diamonds and coal, to taste the hydrogen and oxygen in his glass of water. Lawrence then possessed, or, if you care to put it the other way around, was possessed by a gift to which he was unshakably loyal. I have tried to show how the possession and the loyalty influenced his thinking and writing. How did they affect his life? The answer shall be, as far as possible, in Lawrence's own words. To Catherine Carswell, Lawrence once wrote, "I think you are the only woman I have met who is so intrinsically detached, so essentially separate and isolated, as to be a real writer or artist or recorder. Your relations with other people are only excursions from yourself, and to want children and common human fulfillments is rather a falsity for you, I think. You were never made to meet and mingle, but to remain intact, essentially, whatever your experiences may be." Lawrence's knowledge of the artist was manifestly personal knowledge. He knew by actual experience that the real writer is an essentially separate being, who must not desire to meet and mingle, and who betrays himself when he hankers too yearningly after common human fulfillments. All artists know these facts about their species, and many of them have recorded their knowledge, recorded it very often with distress. Being intrinsically detached is no joke. Lawrence certainly suffered his whole life from the essential solitude to which his gift condemned him. "What ails me," he wrote to the psychologist Dr. Trigant Burrow, "is the absolute frustration of my primeval societal instinct. I think societal instinct much deeper than sex instinct, and societal repression much more devastating. There is no repression of the sexual individual comparable to the repression of the societal man in me, by the individual ego, my own and everybody else's. Myself, I suffer badly from being so cut off. At times one is forced to be essentially a hermit. I don't want to be. But anything else is either a personal tussle or a money tussle. Sickening, except, of course, just for ordinary acquaintance, which remains acquaintance. One has no real human relations. That is so devastating." One has no human relations. This is the complaint of every artist. The artist's first duty is to his genius, his daemon, but cannot serve two masters. Lawrence, as it happened, had an extraordinary gift for establishing an intimate relationship with almost anyone he met. Here, in the Bournemouth boarding house where he was staying after his illness in 1912, he writes, "Here I get mixed up in people's lives so. It's very interesting, sometimes a bit painful, often jolly. But I run to such close intimacy with folk, it is complicating. But I love to have myself in a bit of a tangle." His love for his art was greater, however, than his love for a tangle, And whenever the tangle threatened to compromise his activity as an artist, it was the tangle that was sacrificed. He retired. Lawrence's only deep and abiding human relationship was with his wife. "It is hopeless for me," he wrote to a fellow artist, "to try to do anything without I have a woman at the back of me. Bucklin, or somebody like him, daren't sit in a cafe except with his back to the wall. I daren't sit in the world without a woman behind me. A woman that I love sort of keeps me in direct communication with the unknown, in which otherwise I am a bit lost." For the rest, he was condemned by his gift to an essential separateness. Often, it is true, he blamed the world for his exile. And it comes to this, that the oneness of mankind is destroyed in me by the war. I am I, and you are you, and all heaven and hell lie in the chasm between. Believe me, I am infinitely hurt by being thus torn off from the body of mankind, but so it is, and it is right. It was right because, in reality, it was not the war that had torn him from the body of mankind. It was his own talent, the strange divinity to which he owed his primary allegiance. "I will not live any more in this time," he wrote on another occasion. "I know what it is. I reject it. As far as I possibly can, I will stand outside this time. I will live my life and, if possible, be happy, though the whole world slides in horror down into the bottomless pit. I believe that the highest virtue is to be happy, living in the greatest truth, not submitting to the falsehood of these personal times." The adjective is profoundly significant. Of all the possible words of disparagement which might be applied to our uneasy age, personal is about the last that would occur to most of us. To Lawrence, it was the first. His gift was a gift of feeling and rendering the unknown, the mysteriously other. To one possessed by such a gift, almost any age would have seemed unduly and dangerously personal. He had to reject and escape. But when he had escaped, he could not help deploring the absence of real human relationships. Spasmodically, he tried to establish contact with the body of mankind. There were the recurrent projects for colonies in remote corners of the earth. They all fell through. There were his efforts to join existing political organizations. "But somehow," he wrote, "I seem to have lost touch altogether with the progressive clique. In Croydon, the socialists are so stupid, and the Fabians so flat." Not only Croydon, alas. Then, during the war, there was his plan to cooperate with a few friends to take independent political action. "But," again he wrote, "I would like to be remote, in Italy, writing my Sewell's words. To have to speak in the body is a violation to me." And in the end, he wouldn't violate himself. He remained aloof, remote, essentially separate. "It isn't scenery one lives by," he wrote from Cornwall in 1916, "but the freedom of moving about alone." How acutely he suffered from this freedom by which he lived. Kangaroo describes a later stage of the debate between the solitary artist and the man who wanted social responsibilities and contact with the body of mankind. Lawrence, like the hero of his novel, decided against contact. He was by nature not a leader of men, but a prophet, a voice crying in the wilderness of his own isolation. The desert was his place, and yet he felt himself an exile in it. To Rolf Gardner he wrote in 1926, "I should love to be connected with something, with some few people in something. As far as anything matters, I have always been very much alone and regretted it. But I can't belong to clubs or societies or Freemasons or any other damn thing. So if there is, with you, an activity I can belong to, I shall thank my stars. But of course I shall be wary beyond words of committing myself." He was, in fact, so wary that he never committed himself, but died remote and unconnected as he had lived. The daemon would not allow it to be otherwise. Whether Lawrence might not have been happier if he had disobeyed his daemon and forced himself, at least, into mechanical and external concoction with the body of mankind, I forbear to speculate. Spontaneity is not the only and infallible secret of happiness, nor is a would-be existence necessarily disastrous, but this is by the way. It was, I think, the sense of being cut off that sent Lawrence on his restless wanderings round the earth. His travels were at once a flight and a search for some society with which he could establish contact, for a world where the times were not personal, and conscious knowing that had not yet perverted living. A search and at the same time a flight from the miseries and evils of the society into which he had been born, and for which, in spite of his artist's detachment, he could not help feeling profoundly responsible. He felt himself English in the teeth of all the world, even in the teeth of England. That was why he had to go to Ceylon and Australia and Mexico. He could not have felt so intensely English in England without involving himself in corporative political action, without belonging and being attached. But to attach himself was something he could not bring himself to do, something that the artist in him felt as a violation. He was at once too English and too intensely an artist to stay at home. Perhaps it is necessary for me to try these places. Perhaps it is my destiny to know the world. It only excites the outside of me. The inside it leaves more isolated and stoic than ever. That's how it is. It is all a form of running away from oneself and the great problems, all this Wild West and the strange Australia. But I try to keep quite clear. One forms not the faintest inward attachment, especially here in America. His search was as fruitless as his flight was ineffective. He could not escape either from his homesickness or his sense of responsibility, and he never found a society to which he could belong. In a kind of despair, he plunged yet deeper into the surrounding mystery, into the dark night of that otherness whose essence and symbol is the sexual experience. In Lady Chatterley's Lover, Lawrence wrote the epilogue to his travels and, from his long and fruitless experience of flight and search, drew what was for him the inevitable moral. It is a strange and beautiful book, but inexpressibly sad. And then so, at the bottom, was its author's life. Lawrence's psychological isolation resulted, as we have seen, in his seeking physical isolation from the body of mankind. This physical isolation reacted upon his thoughts. "Don't mind if I am impertinent," he wrote to one of his correspondents at the end of a rather dogmatic letter. "Living here alone, one gets so different sort of ex cathedra. To live in isolation above the medley has its advantages, but it also imposes certain penalties. Those who take a bird's eye view of the world often see clearly and comprehensively, but they tend to ignore all tiresome details, all the difficulties of social life, and ignoring, to judge too sweepingly, and to condemn too lightly. Nietzsche spent his most fruitful years perched on the tops of the mountains, or plunged in the yet more abysmal solitude of boarding houses by the Mediterranean. That was why, a delicate and sensitive man, he could be so bloodthirstily censorious, so wrong for all his gifts as well as so right. From the deserts of New Mexico, from rustic Tuscany or Sicily, from the Australian bush, Lawrence observed and judged and advised the distant world of men. The judgments, as might be expected, were often sweeping and violent. The advice, though admirable so far as it went, inadequate. Political advice from even the most greatly gifted of religious innovators is always inadequate, for it is never at bottom advice about politics, but always about something else. Differences in quantity, if sufficiently great, produce differences of quality. This sheet of paper, for example, is qualitatively different from the electrons of which it is composed. An analogous difference divides the politician's world from the world of the artist, or the moralist, or the religious teacher. It is the business of the artist, writes Lawrence, to follow it, the war, to the heart of the individual fighters, not to talk in armies and nations and numbers, but to track it home, their war. And it's at the bottom of almost every Englishman's heart, the war, the desire of war, the will to war, and at the bottom of every German heart. But an appeal to the individual heart can have very little effect on politics, which is a science of averages, An actuary can tell you how many people are likely to commit suicide next year, and no artist or moralist or messiah can, by an appeal to the individual heart, prevent his forecast from being remarkably correct. If the things which are Caesar's differ from the things which are God's, it is because Caesar's things are numbered by the thousands and millions, whereas God's things are single individual souls. The things of Lawrence's dark God were not even individual souls, they were the psychological atoms whose patterned coming together constitutes a soul. When Lawrence offers political advice, it refers to matters which are not really political at all. The political world of enormous numbers was to him a nightmare, and he fled from it. Primitive communities are so small that their politics are essentially unpolitical. That, for Lawrence, was one of their greatest charms. Looking back from some faraway and underpopulated vantage point at the enormous, innumerable modern world, he was appalled by what he saw. He condemned, he advised, but at bottom and finally, he felt himself impotent to deal with Caesar's alien and inhuman problems. "I wish there were miracles," was his final despairing comment. "I am tired of the old laborious way of working things to their conclusions." But, alas, there are no miracles, and faith, even the faith of a man of genius, moves no mountains. Enough of explanation and interpretation. To those who knew Lawrence, not why, but that he was what he happened to be, is the important fact. I remember very clearly my first meeting with him. The place was London, the time 1915, but Lawrence's passionate talk was of the geographically remote, of the personally very near, of the horrors in the middle distance, war, winter, the town. He would not speak, for he was on the point, so he imagined, of setting off to Florida, where he was going to plant that colony of escape, of which up to the last he never ceased to dream. Sometimes the name and sight of this seed of a happier and different world was purely fanciful. It was called Rananim, for example, and it was an island like Prospero's. Sometimes it had its place on the map, and its name was Florida, Cornwall, Sicily, Mexico, and again, for a time, the English countryside. That wintry afternoon in 1915, it was Florida. Before tea was over, he asked me if I would join the colony. And though I was an intellectually cautious young man, not at all inclined to enthusiasms, though Lawrence had startled and embarrassed me with sincerities of a kind to which my upbringing had not accustomed me, I answered yes. Fortunately, no doubt, the Florida scheme fell through. Cities of God have always crumbled, and Lawrence's city, his village rather, for he hated cities, his village of the dark God would doubtless have disintegrated like all the rest. It was better that it should have remained, as it was always to remain, a project and a hope. And I knew this even as I said I would join the colony. But there was something about Lawrence which made such knowledge, when one was in his presence, curiously irrelevant. He might have impracticable schemes. He might say or write things that were demonstrably incorrect, or even, on occasion, as when he talked about science, absurd. But to a very considerable extent it didn't matter. What mattered was always Lawrence himself, was the fire that burned within him, that glowed with so strange and marvellous a radiance in almost all he wrote. My second meeting with Lawrence took place some years later, during one of his brief revisitings of that after-war England which had come so much to dread and to dislike. Then, in 1925, while in India, I received a letter from Squatorno. He had read some essays I had written on Italian travel, said he liked them, suggested a meeting. The next year we were in Florence, and so was he. From that time till his death we were often together. At Florence, at Forte dei Marmi, for a whole winter at Debdaretz, at Bandol in Paris, at Chèvres, at Forte, and again at Vence, where he died. In a spasmodically kept diary, I find this entry under the date of December 27th, 1927. Lunched and spent the PM with the Lawrences. DHL in admirable form, talking wonderfully. He is one of the few people I feel real respect and admiration for. Of most other eminent people I have met, I feel that at any rate I belong to the same species as they do. But this man has something different and superior in kind, not degree. Different and superior in kind. I think almost everyone who knew him must have felt that Lawrence was this, a being somehow of another order, more sensitive, more highly conscious, more capable of feeling than even the most gifted of common men. He had, of course, his weaknesses and defects. He had his intellectual limitations which he seemed to have imposed deliberately upon himself. But these weaknesses and defects and limitations did not affect the fact of his superior otherness. They diminished him quantitatively, so to speak, whereas the otherness was qualitative. Spill half your glass of wine, and what remains is still wine. Water, however full the glass may be, is always tasteless and without colour. To be with Lawrence was a kind of adventure, a voyage of discovery into newness and otherness. For, being himself of a different order, he inhabited a universe different from that of common men, a brighter and intenser world of which, while he spoke, he would make you free. He looked at things with the eyes, so it seemed, of a man who had been at the brink of death, and to whom, as he emerges from the darkness, the world reveals itself as unfathomably beautiful and mysterious. For Lawrence, existence was one continuous convalescence. It was as though he were newly reborn from a mortal illness every day of his life. What these convalescent eyes saw, his most casual speech would reveal. A walk with him in the country was a walk through that marvellously rich and significant landscape which was at once the background and the principal personage of all his novels. He seemed to know by personal experience what it was like to be a tree, or a daisy, or a breaking wave, or even the mysterious moon itself. He could get inside the skin of an animal and tell you in the most convincing detail how it felt and how, dimly, inhumanly, it thought. Of Black-Eyed Susan, for example, the cow at his New Mexican ranch, he was never tired of speaking, nor was I ever tired of listening to his account of her character and her bovine philosophy. He sees, Vernon Lee once said to me, more than a human being ought to see. Perhaps, she added, that's why he hates humanity so much. Why also he loved it so much, and not only humanity, nature too, and even the supernatural. For wherever he looked, he saw more than a human being ought to see, saw more, and therefore loved and hated more. To be with him was to find oneself transported to one of the frontiers of human consciousness. For an inhabitant of the safe metropolis of thought and feeling, it was a most exciting experience. One of the great charms of Lawrence as a companion was that he would never be bored, and so could never be boring. He was able to absorb himself completely in what he was doing at the moment, and he regarded no task as too humble for him to undertake, nor so trivial that it was not worth his while to do it well. He could cook, he could sew, he could darn a stocking and milk a cow. He was an efficient woodcutter and a good hand at embroidery. Fires always burned when he had laid them, and a floor, after Lawrence had scrubbed it, was thoroughly clean. Moreover, he possessed what is, for a highly strung and highly intelligent man, an even more remarkable accomplishment. He knew how to do nothing. He could just sit and be perfectly content. And his contentment, while one remained in his company, was infectious. As infectious as Lawrence's contented placidity were his high spirits and his laughter, even in the last year of his life. When his illness had got the upper hand and was killing him inchmeal, Lawrence could still laugh, on occasion with something of the old and exuberant gaiety. Often, alas, towards the end, the laughter was bitter, and the high spirits almost terrifyingly savage. I have heard him sometimes speak of men and their ways with a kind of demoniac mockery, to which it was painful. For all the extraordinary brilliance and profundity of what he said, it was painful to listen. The secret consciousness of his dissolution filled the last years of his life with an overpowering sadness. How tragically the splendid curve of the letters droops at the end towards the darkness. It was, however, in terms of danger that he chose to express his sadness. Emotional indecency always shocked him profoundly, And since anger seemed to him less indecent as an emotion than a resigned or complaining melancholy, he preferred to be angry. He took his revenge on the fate that made him sad by fiercely deriding everything. And because the sadness of the slowly dying man was so unspeakably deep, his mockery was frighteningly savage. The laughter of the earlier Lawrence, and on occasion, as I have said, even the later Lawrence, was without bitterness and wholly delightful. Vitality has the attractiveness of beauty, and in Lawrence there was a continuously springing fountain of vitality. It went on welling up to him, leaping now and then into a great explosion of bright foam and iridescence, long after the time when, by all the rules of medicine, he should have been dead. For the last 2 years he was like a flame burning on in miraculous disregard of the fact that there was no more fuel to justify its existence. One grew, in spite of constantly renewed alarms, so well accustomed to seeing the flame blazing away, self-fed, in its broken and empty lamp that one almost came to believe that the miracle would be prolonged indefinitely, but it could not be. When, after several months of separation, I saw him again at Vence in the early spring of 1930, the miracle was at an end, the flame guttering to extinction. A few days later it was quenched. Beautiful and absorbingly interesting in themselves, the letters which follow are also of the highest importance as biographical documents. In them, Lawrence has written his life and painted his own portrait. Few men have given more of themselves in their letters. Lawrence is there almost in his entirety. Almost, for he obeyed both of Robert Burns' injunctions. I free, often your story tell, but we are bosom crony. But still keep something to yoursel, ye scarcely tell to ony. The letters show us in Lawrence as he was in his daily living. We see him in all his moods, and it is curious and amusing to note how his mood will change according to his correspondent. My kindliness makes me sometimes a bit false, he says of himself severely. In other words, he knew how to adapt himself. To one correspondent he is gay, at moments even larky, because larkiness is expected of him. To another he is gravely reflective. To a third he speaks the language of prophesying and revelation. We follow him from one vividly seen and recorded landscape to another. We watch him during the war, a subjectivist and a solitary artist, desperately fighting his battle against the nightmare of objective facts and all the inhumanly numerous things that are Caesar's. Fighting and inevitably losing. After the war, we accompany him round the world as he seeks, now in one continent, now in another, some external desert to match the inner wilderness from which he utters his prophetic cry, or some community of which he can feel himself a member. We see him being drawn towards his fellows and then repelled again, making up his mind to force himself into some relation with society, and then, suddenly, changing it again and letting himself drift once more on the current of circumstances and his own inclinations. And finally, as his illness begins to get the better of him, we see him obscured by a dark cloud of sadness, the terrible sadness, out of which, in one mood, he wrote his savage Nettles, in another, The Man Who Died, that lovely and profoundly moving story of the miracle for which, somewhere in his mind, he still hoped against the certain knowledge that it could never happen. In the early part of his career specifically, and again towards the end, Lawrence was a most prolific correspondent. There was, however, an intermediate period during his time of wandering when he seems to have written very little. Of letters with the date of these after-war years, not more than a dozen or two have so far turned up, and there seems to be no reason to believe that further inquiries will reveal the existence of many more. It is not because they have been destroyed or are being withheld that Lawrence's letters of this period are so scarce. It is because, for one reason or another, he did not there care to write letters, that he did not want to feel himself in relationship with anyone. After a time, the stream begins again, but the later letters, though plentiful and good, are neither so numerous nor so richly and variously delightful as the earlier. One feels that Lawrence no longer wanted to give of himself so fully to his correspondence as in the past. In selecting the letters which Lawrence's correspondents have so generously placed at my disposal, I have been guided by a few simple and obvious principles. Trivial notes have not been reproduced, nor, in most cases, business letters. There is, for example, an enormous correspondence referring to the publication and distribution of the first Florentine edition of Lady Chatterley. This has been omitted altogether. A certain number of passages that might have given pain to the person mentioned in them, or that deal with personalities which it did not seem right or decent to make public, have been cut out. Here and there, for obvious reasons, I have suppressed a name. In conclusion, I would like to express my thanks to Mrs. Enid Hilton for her invaluable help in preparing this volume for the press. Lacking her cooperation, I should have been lost. Aldous Huxley. And that is the introduction to this book, Selected Letters of D.H. Lawrence, published by Penguin Books.